Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this IWA event. We're just seeing participants tick up, so we're going to give a minute while people enter the virtual room with us today. Um, welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome. As more people come into the room, we're waiting, just letting people filter in, and we'll start in about a minute as we wait for people to join. All right, people are still trickling in. But the introductory bit is always the most boring bit, and you're all here to listen to Anwen talk. So, good morning and welcome everyone to the launch of the IWA's latest report, which is called Fostering Democratic Innovations, Lessons from Around the World. And it's produced in collaboration with Aberystwyth University and the Centre for Welsh Politics and Society. This report has been co-authored by leading academics, one of which is with us on screen, Dr Anwen Elias, alongside Dr Ellery Phillips and Dr Jennifer Wolowick. And the report examines democratic innovations put into practice around the world and how they could work, and examines how they could work in a Welsh context in the future. This particular report was produced as part of the IWA's wider work on fostering understanding and participation in Wales's ongoing constitutional discussion, which is funded by the Legal Education Foundation. And this timely report builds directly off the back of the work of the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales, of which Anwen was a commissioner, who in their final report, which was published last year, recommended democratic innovations as a means to strengthen Wales's ailing democracy, with an expert advisory panel as a first step in this direction. Said advisory group has recently been announced by the Deputy First Minister, and luckily enough, will be chaired by our speaker today, Anwen, and I'll let you go into that a little bit later. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Joe Rossiter. I'm one of two IWA co-directors. And for those of you who don't know us, the IWA is Wales's leading independent think tank, has a long track record of shaping debates and influencing change in Wales through policy, research and advocacy, and our online and print publications, which is a platform for robust comment and debate, and our agenda-setting events such as this one. But most importantly, we're a membership organisation with over 700 members across the country and far further afield. We're funded by our members and the events we run ourselves, and independent trusts and foundations for some of our policy work. Importantly, also, we're politically independent and don't represent a specific sector, trade, or interest group. Instead, we seek to bridge policy and institutional divides and show what might be possible when we work together differently, seeking consensus where possible and robustly challenging the status quo when we need to. We're especially interested in identifying and facilitating long-term change on issues that will make a difference to Wales's economy and democracy. And of course, we're talking all things democracy today. So if you'd like to know more about what we as the IWA do and support us, please join us as a member if you aren't already, and help us to shape Wales's future. Before I introduce our speaker, who I've kind of introduced already, there's a few housekeeping issues. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat and engage with each other in the chat today. Say hello. We've got members and supporters joining us today from lots of different parts of Welsh public life, local authorities, Welsh Government, Senedd, Open University, Electoral Reform Society, lots of different organisations who are present in this space, amongst lots of others. So yeah, and share your email if you're willing to be contacted by others. Obviously, this is a Zoom webinar. Participants are muted by me, the host. So if you want to we've got lots and lots of time for questions. So if you want to add questions, please add it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be able to put the questions to Anwen rather than the chat, which is more for, I guess, reacting and not asking questions specifically. And please remember also that all the chat and the questions are recorded. We'll be keeping the event to a maximum of an hour, but there's lots of time for questions. And if you feel inspired to post on social media, whatever your social media platform of choice, please use, you can tag us at Institute of Welsh Affairs on most platforms, and we suggest using the hashtag IWA Democracy for this specific event. If you've got a colleague who can't make it today and they were really interested in this, or you want to share it with someone afterwards, we're going to be putting this out as a YouTube video and on our podcast chat platforms as an audio recording. So please do share it if you think you've been inspired to share the conversation. Now, enough of me. We're going to move on to our speaker, who I've already heavily hinted at, and you can see her on screen, is Dr. Anwen Elias. So she's going to launch the report, talk through the report, of which she is co-authored alongside her colleagues. For those of you that don't know Anwen, she's an IWA fellow. She's a reader in politics at Aberystwyth University and co-director of the Centre for Welsh Politics and Society at Wizard. She was also a commissioner on the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. And as I said before, she's the newly announced chair of the Welsh Government Innovating Democracy Advisory Group. And we're hugely grateful for Anwen, Jen and Eleri for what you'll be able to see now that you'll all have access to the report, which is available online, is a comprehensive yet accessible paper, which hopefully meaningfully contributes to this public discussion we're all having on where Wales's democracy can go next. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Anwen, who will run through the report. Please get your questions in, because I've got some questions, but I think your questions will hopefully be more interesting than my questions. So over to you, Anwen.
Bore da, bawb. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction and for the opportunity to write the report, which deals with some issues that have become very important to me in my own thinking about Welsh democracy. So great to have a chance to think through some of those ideas and think about them in the context of Wales and what they might be able to bring to our Welsh democracy. Because the starting point for this report is that democracy in Wales is not in good health. We know that turnout in elections in Wales is low. We know that knowledge of how democratic government works and trust in politics and politicians is also low. Most people in Wales feel unable to influence the political decisions that impact on their daily lives. And there's a general sense that life is not getting better or easier for most people. So we're facing some challenges in the way that democracy works and delivers in Wales. They're not challenges that are unique to Wales. They're challenges that democracies across the world are facing. But when we look around the world at how other places are trying to respond to these kinds of challenges, there's a growing interest in new methods of how to involve citizens in democratic politics. And that's involvement beyond just voting in elections or responding to a consultation. And these methods are often called democratic innovations. It's a term that's used differently by different people, but in general, democratic innovations are methods that focus on involving citizens in between elections, as I mentioned, but also reimagining citizens as co-producers and co-problem solvers alongside decision makers. They're kinds of approaches that the report talks about things like citizen assemblies, participatory budgeting, direct democracy methods such as referenda, co-production of public policy, and so on. So those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about when we talk about democratic innovations. And again, what they have in common is this ambition to enable citizens to participate in and deliberate on issues and challenges. And that might be to identify policy priorities, or to develop or scrutinise policy recommendations, and so on. And again, just looking at evidence from around the world about how these approaches can help us tackle challenges facing democracies. The evidence is that they can improve policy making by bringing the collective wisdom of people together and thinking differently and coming up with new ideas about how to solve policy challenges. They can help us find ways through divisive or complex policy challenges. They can bring greater legitimacy to policy decisions. They can create more informed and active citizens who better understand the complexities and trade-offs of decision making, and they can help us rebuild trust in democracy. So our starting point here is that these are things that we should really be thinking about in the context of Welsh democracy in terms of helping us tackle the challenges or the weaknesses of Welsh democracy. So in the report, we try to do three things. So firstly, we just wanted to raise awareness of what some of these democratic innovations are. So what are they? What are some of the different approaches and how they're used around the world? We define, there's a particular definition of democratic innovations we use in the report. You can read that for yourself. But we use that definition to identify five categories, if you like, of approaches. And we describe these, we summarize how they involve people, how they work, some of the issues and context where they've been applied. We give lots of case studies so that you can get a flavour of different kinds of issues and levels of government at which they've been applied. And I'll just give you two examples of the kinds of approaches that we look at. So participatory budgeting is one, for example. So participatory budgeting has been around for decades and aims to give citizens a say on how to allocate public funds. So they're most often used at community and local government level, typically initiated by decision makers who have public funds to spend. They allocate some of those funds to a particular issue area, and then participants are invited to discuss and decide on how to spend that money. And then there's commitment on the part of decision makers to implement those decisions. So originated in Brazil, but actually is spread around the world. And that's, again, a lot of evidence around how to use that approach well, how to do that well. The other one, which we talk about, are mini publics, such as citizen assemblies, citizens' juries. I mention this because this is a particular approach which has received a lot of and increasing coverage in the media in different places. There are two things that characterize mini publics like citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries. One is that participation takes the form of randomly selected citizens, selected by lottery, and they represent the broader public in some way. So they're a mini public because they represent the wider public in a particular community or society. And that they're representative in a particular way. For example, it could be in terms of demographic characteristics, the age, gender, ethnicity, language of a community. But you can also select for representation on the issue that you are talking about. So, for example, citizen assemblies on climate change will also aim to select people with a wide range of views on climate change. The other thing that's characteristics of a mini public is that they follow a process that is typical of a deliberative process specifically. And typically in a deliberative process, there are three stages. There's a learning phase where participants are given information on the issue from different perspectives. There's a deliberative phase where participants get a chance to discuss and reflect on the information that they've been given. And then there's a decision-making phase where participants come to informed viewpoints about the issue. And they often determine priorities, or they identify policy solutions or make recommendations. So beyond those characteristics, there are differences in terms of size. A citizens' jury, for example, is quite small, 10 to 15 people. Citizens' assembly is bigger. They tend to meet over a different number of days. Typically a citizens' jury, for example, 3 to 5 days, or a citizens' assembly, 18 to 20 days on average. And then we give some case studies of how these different mini publics have operated at different levels of government. And again, the kinds of issues that they are well suited for, and also the different kind of ways in which they fit into a policy process. At the start of a policy process, if you want to explore options, you can also use these methods to look at specific kind of policy issues if you want recommendations, or to scrutinize specific policy proposals. So just two examples there of the kinds of democratic innovations we look at. The other ones include collaborative governance, methods such as co-production, for example, where you bring together decision makers, stakeholders and citizens in different kinds of processes to explore policy solutions together. We look at referenda and citizens' initiatives. And citizens' initiatives are processes where citizens can come together and, through signatures, for example, initiate a parliament to look at a policy issue. Or in some places, if you reach a threshold of signatures, you can initiate a public vote on an issue. Then there are some creative and arts-based methods that we look at, which are interesting, because a lot of these other methods look at or focus on talking, discussing, kind of argumentation. And there's an argument that creative and arts-based approaches actually allow you to bring in different kinds of perspectives into discussions, more emotional, visceral responses, lived experiences into a discussion. So we look at some of those methods, and then we also look at some digital tools and innovations. And sometimes these digital innovations kind of cross-cut some of the other methods. So digital platforms for citizen assemblies or participatory budgeting. And they kind of open up participation to more people. But there are also some really interesting examples from Taiwan and Barcelona of really kind of interesting platforms, digital platforms, where actually you can have all kinds of interesting kind of participation and deliberation happen at scale. So there's a lot of information there to kind of just raise awareness about what democratic innovations are and how they're used in different places. Then we go on in the report to think about what is good practice that's emerging from all of these examples. And one of the interesting things that we see happening as more and more places are trying to experiment with these approaches is that there's also a lot of evaluation of them, and a lot of really useful how-to guides, practical toolkits, for example, for doing some of these things. And in the annex of the report, we just list a lot of these resources for, again, people who are interested in knowing more and were thinking maybe of doing some of these things themselves. There's a good resource list there. But we've taken from kind of these resources looking for good practice in terms of how actually we might do democratic innovations. And there are several things that we flag up here. Again, I'll only mention a few of them here. I think there is something important to think about in terms of who do we want to take part in some of these democratic innovations. And I think there's a question here about thinking about the difference between participation and deliberation. Now, they're two terms which, unhelpfully, are quite often used interchangeably. But I think they're quite different things in terms of what you're aspiring to achieve through a participatory or a deliberative process. So participation typically aims to be as open as possible to as many people as possible. So you want to open up to include as many people as possible. But what we know from practice and experience is actually that not everyone takes part. Participation rates are usually very low, and often people self-select. It's usually the people who are most interested who take part. So you have a lot of the frequently heard voices, and you often don't hear from people who don't typically take part in these things. And so in practice, they're not as inclusive as in principle they aim to be. A deliberative process tries to kind of tackle that because it deliberately selects a representative group of people and tries to bring in people who wouldn't typically take part in these kinds of things. And it's deliberately structured to include different perspectives in the deliberation and achieve that deeper engagement and reflection. But again, there are trade-offs. There's a downside to that. By definition, you have fewer people. Sometimes you want wider discussion. It's difficult to link citizen assemblies, for example, into the wider public debate. So there are trade-offs there in terms of participation and deliberation. And some of the good practice emerging internationally is actually to think about designing processes which try to kind of balance those trade-offs, which include participation and deliberation in different parts of a process. So that you have opportunities for everybody to participate, but also that you have opportunities to perhaps focus in a more deliberative way, in a deeper way. So we talk a little bit about that distinction between participation and deliberation and the design of democratic innovations to take into account the kind of some of those trade-offs. We then also talk about how to make sure that democratic innovations have an impact, because a lot of the critique of democratic innovations is that they are one-off, isolated initiatives, and actually very often they don't lead to any change in decision-making. Outcomes of citizens' participation and deliberation is often ignored. So what can you do to address that? And a lot of the innovation, again, in this space is thinking about how can you make democratic innovations, how can you institutionalize them? How can you embed them into decision-making? How can you link them into legislatures, executives, in a more permanent and ongoing way? So we look at, for example, some examples there around citizens' assemblies, which have been made permanent parts of decision-making. So there's a permanent citizens' assembly linked into the regional parliament in Belgium, for example, and deliberative committees that combine citizens and politicians that feed into the decision-making of the regional parliament in Brussels as an ongoing way of ensuring citizen voice feeds into kind of decision-making. And then we also look at good practice in terms of how to build capacity to do these things. And in particular, we look at initiatives around raising awareness of what democratic innovations are and how to do them, but also training and capacity building, and particularly, I think, among civil servants and politicians, because these are often key actors in commissioning and resourcing these kinds of activities. But also, you really have to have buy-in from civil servants and politicians to open up politics to citizens. And again, it kind of goes back to the previous point about allowing these things to meaningfully make an impact. And you can only do that if you have civil servants and politicians who are willing to kind of cede power to citizens and really take on board the thinking of citizens and recommendations and decisions that citizens make and then act on those. So the report then finishes off by thinking about, so what do we make of all of this in the context of Wales, and what can it and should it mean for us in Wales? We do a little bit of mapping of where we are in Wales in terms of democratic innovations, and there is some use of democratic innovations in Wales. Co-production, for example, is a well-established collaborative way of reforming public services. There's some use of participatory budgeting, some examples of citizens' assemblies and juries. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act also provides a clear expectation that public bodies involve people in local and national decision-making and across policy sectors. So that's all good, but there are challenges. And one of those challenges, I think, is that the examples of democratic innovations in Wales are, for the most part, quite ad hoc and one-off initiatives, and there's not always very clear evidence of what has changed as a result of those outputs and recommendations. There's also very little systematic evaluation of the barriers and opportunities to undertaking such initiatives. And learning from one project isn't often shared more widely as a means of building knowledge and capacity more broadly and to inform future activities. And I think importantly, the potential of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to fundamentally transform citizen involvement practices in Wales hasn't yet been realised. And I think one problem there is that, we really don't know, actually. We don't really have data, evidence on how involvement as a way of working has been implemented in practice. We know there are some examples of good practice, but actually we don't really know systematically how public bodies have tried to implement and the range of ways in which they've tried to do that. And again, kind of the barriers to doing that more systematically. So we end up with 3 recommendations that we make in terms of thinking about how Wales can think more about democratic innovations as a way of strengthening our democracy. And the first one is that I think we need to do more in terms of awareness raising of what democratic innovations are, why and how they could help us strengthen democracy in Wales. And this report is part of that work, but we also need to think about how we do that in an ongoing way beyond this report. We need, I think, more research to better understand existing activities, map what we're already doing, what we're doing well, but also where we could improve, but also to understand, again, what some of the barriers are to broadening and scaling these kinds of approaches. And then with that knowledge, a third recommendation we make is that I think there's an opportunity for a systematic and collaborative kind of a design process using some of the participatory and deliberative methods that we advocate for. So to use some of those methods to actually come up with specific recommendations around how we could bring more democratic innovations into our democratic politics in Wales, and again co-producing with decision makers, stakeholders and citizens specific proposals for fostering sustained and impactful democratic innovations in Wales. And I'll stop there.
Brill, yeah. And that was a like whistle-stop tour.
It was.
It's not a overly kind of long report. It's packed, every page is kind of packed full of really interesting detail and also expressed in a what is a kind of atypically easy to read mode as well. And I think you've gone through all of the different parts of the report really comprehensively, which is really useful. And I think if I was to point at, some of the impact that I see of having this report is there's been a huge amount of interest in democratic innovations. You hear it spoken about a lot in policy circles and beyond in terms of people who are delivering public services and wanting to do that that involvement bit of the Future Generations Act you speak to. But there's not a kind of shared terminology on what we mean in terms of what democratic innovations are, what are the different types of them, and hopefully your report helps to enable us to talk in a shared terminology that recognizes that these democratic innovations they're not proposing to be a panacea for what are a significant series of systemic challenges to Wales's democracy, and that each of them come with different trade-offs. So there's choices to be made. There's no real easy solution that does everything you want. And you hear some advocates of different democratic innovations really vociferously talking about that as being the solution. But as you say, it's kind of you could need to be very purposeful about what it is they're trying to do, and therefore make a method that matches it, and also it's got to kind of have a systemic political buy-in for it to make a lot of difference. Anyway, in regards to other stuff in the report that I'd really urge people to look at, I think there's a table in the report that is really useful. If you're kind of new to the democratic innovation space, then just looking at the table, which sets out what the different types of democratic innovations are, list the amount of participants, lists what kind of challenges they're best suited to and what they're not, what some of the trade-offs are. So I would urge people to just look at that table as well. And the other bit that came through to me when you were speaking, as whilst we talk of them as innovations, and they are innovative. They're trying to do something really different with the way that our democracy functions. There's a whole heap of case studies for every single type of democratic innovation discussed in the report, which is super useful because, as you say, these are innovations, but they're happening. There's lots of practice for us to learn from. And as you say, even in Wales, there's some practice to learn from. But we're now talking about how they can be function as a kind of systemic intervention to improve Wales's democracy. So that's enough from me. But I've got a couple of questions. We're getting some questions in the Q&A. We'll try and get through them all. But I've got a kind of starter, I guess, which it really tries to grapple with this kind of systemizing this. So we've got this Senedd reform that's happening in the next 3 years. So, Wales is really going in a different direction than the rest of the UK in trying to cultivate a democracy that is, distinctly Welsh, whatever that looks like in terms of having an amount of members and a different electoral system. You've spoken about, how you can try and mainstream some of these methods through those democratic processes and ensure they're not a bolt-on. What are kind of, from where you see it, what are the opportunities for the Senedd to play a role in terms of cultivating a better democracy and using some of these methods as we get beyond 2030, because that's the kind of political cycle we're on?
Yeah, so Senedd reform, of course, is innovating Welsh democracy in particular ways around electoral democracy, and that's all great. But the kinds of democratic innovations that this report talks about is actually about what happens then in between those elections. And I think you're right, Senedd reform is an interesting opportunity to think more broadly, actually, about innovating democracy. And we don't hear a lot, actually, about what some of these approaches might mean for the Senedd and how it works and how it engages with citizens. So some of the most interesting kind of innovations, I think, are about bringing citizen voice into legislatures like the Senedd. And how you can, for example, use citizen assemblies as part of your scrutiny process in the Parliament. The Citizens' Assemblies linked to the regional parliament in East Belgium actually uses citizens' assemblies to identify policy priorities. So even before you get to kind of scrutinising specific legislation, before that, what are the policy priorities for citizens in a particular area? And you use those citizens' assemblies then kind of earlier in that stage of generating ideas. What are the policy issues that we want to focus on and that we want this Parliament to think about? So there are lots of different ways in which you can bring in these democratic innovations. I think the challenge again is you really need political buy-in to do these things. So the Senedd did hold a citizen assembly back in 2019 to look at how the Senedd engages citizens. I'm not really sure what changed actually as a result of that, which is precisely the point. You can do something like that, but if it doesn't kind of lead to change and if it's just a one-off initiative, then I would almost argue, what's the point? There is a risk that you are kind of alienating people where you kind of take their time, you get them to discuss something and then nothing happens. So I think there are good examples there that we can look at in terms of involving citizens in the work of the Senedd. And once we get through kind of the big programme of electoral changes in Wales, then I hope that actually the Senedd can look more seriously at some of these innovations happening elsewhere, to think about his own engagement with citizens in a more innovative way.
Yeah, and I think hopefully they'll have slightly more capacity in order to do that. But I definitely think, as you say, there's lots of examples in the report that talk to how you could do that. And I guess I'm preempting maybe what some of your group's going to look at in terms of, for Welsh government. And the other thing is, yeah, definitely reflection on that. If you do a big, robust process, let it happen, and then nothing seems to happen to what it's, on the terms on which you've set it, then it does strike as a kind of hollow PR exercise. And it's also in that way, if it's not leading to any specific change, it's not, it's not it's not trying to replicate or work around what are winning elections, which are another part of the democratic journey. But it's not if I win this argument with 30 people, it's easier than it where I can have a kind of controlled deliberative process where I'm putting information in is not a in effort to kind of replace larger participation, which is where I think that participation deliberation was really.
Yeah, exactly.
In regards to the case studies, as I said before, we call these methods innovative, and the report highlights that they've already been rolled out across the world. What are the general kind of key principles you observed of innovations from around the world that led to good processes? You've got that part in the report, but if you could speak to any or pick apart any specific example that you hold close to your heart as a good example of what we mean by democratic innovations.
So I think good processes are ones that are actually developed collaboratively in the sense that, a lot of these processes come about through politicians and civil servants who have become interested in these processes themselves and who drive these things forward. But also a lot of these processes come from civil society also pushing this agenda. And I think Belgium is really exciting in this sense, because what you have in Belgium is this kind of confluence of a really active civil society who's experimented with some of these approaches, actually then combining with politicians in different fora to then design and implement what are becoming kind of leading examples of how to do these things well. And so I think that's really interesting. I think what we know as well is that the design of these things are really important. Often, again, good practice is to involve experienced facilitators of participatory and deliberative processes, not just to kind of run these things, but also to design them from the get-go. So to think about what is the right question to ask. How do we kind of design the process where we ensure that we have buy-in at the end, but we set that up at the start. And then how do you design the process and ensure that there is feedback kind of into the political decision-making process, feedback back to the participants about, what's happened as a result of their participation and deliberation. So again, it's that kind of holistic approach, both in terms of who's involved in the design and the delivery, what kinds of methods, and also the evaluation. And again, that's where a lot of the good practice comes from, is really kind of evaluating some of these things. And I would say that, by now we know how to do these things well, and we know how not to do them. So the question then for us in Wales is really just, do we want to do them or not? And how do we want to do them? Because yes, there are lots of examples, there are lots of approaches, but I think we also need to think about, what would work in Wales? What do we want to do in Wales with these approaches? And there's always kind of, it's also important to have that kind of made in Wales kind of take on these things.
Yeah, and I think you sketched that out quite well in regards to, whilst there's loads of challenges with democracy in Wales, there's also loads of opportunities. Like the public
Absolutely. Yeah.
generation embeds a number of these principles. Whether you think that it's rolled them out effectively in the last 10 years or not is another thing. But we've kind of had a conversation that acknowledges this type of deliberation is important. Okay, we've got tons and tons of questions, so I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. But if not, you can reach out to Anwen.
Yeah,
about
definitely.
the report is there. So we've got one here. Are there particular policy areas in Wales which would be more or less suitable for democratic participation? In other words, are there any policy areas devolved to the Senedd where democratic innovations wouldn't work? What do you think?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that you can probably use these approaches for all kinds of policy areas. I think more important is to think about what is it that you want to achieve through kind of bringing citizen voice, or what is the policy issue or challenge that you are facing? And then to think, what is the most appropriate approach for that issue or challenge? So, for example, citizens' assemblies are often used for big, difficult questions. where there are no easy or obvious kind of solutions, where there are quite polarized positions, perhaps. So a citizens' assembly can be quite useful in that sense of kind of bigger picture, looking at arguments for and against, looking at different options. They can also be quite useful to kind of as a visioning exercise, what are the options, what are the priorities? Something like participatory budgeting, kind of by its nature, tends to be more specific. So it's looking in detail at a kind of a particular policy area and think about how can we spend specifically on different areas. So I think it's rather thinking about, what is the policy issue or challenge, and how could citizen input help to think differently or give you a different perspective. So I don't think there are issues actually that you couldn't use participatory or deliberative approaches for. And in fact, I think there's probably an example, if you're thinking of a policy issue and you're thinking, could I use a democratic innovation approach? There's probably an example of how that's been done already out there. And if I can recommend one particular resource, which is excellent, it's a database called Participedia, and there's a link to it at the end of the report. And it's a database of, democratic innovations. And if you search there, you'll probably find a democratic innovation on a policy area that you might be interested in.
Interesting. Good answer. The other thing that I was thinking of there was, you hear a lot of these used for those really difficult, knotty problems like climate change, especially when you're asking people to trade. You're expecting some behavior change and you're wanting to test behavior change against a group of representative citizens. I think it was interesting just to see, as an aside, the UK Climate Change Committee have now got a citizens panel that they test some of what they're going to say and suggest. And because they sit as a kind of independent body of government, they can kind of push government in a certain direction. I think that's a really interesting example of how a body that might not be, a democratic elected body, but they're using a long-term relationship, a deliberative relationship with a group of citizens to then go to government and say, look, we've had this evidence discussion on heat pumps, for example, and therefore you can make a larger kind of discussion on what that would result in anyway. That's an interesting example that I've heard of recently. Second question from Dr. Ben Gwachmai. To me, there are great successes mentioned in the report, like Barcelona and Taiwan. Have any parts of Welsh government or arm's length bodies use similar platforms that can be maintained relatively easily while ensuring further transparency?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. And clearly there's an opportunity there, I think, because again, a lot of this technology is open source. Diffidem, for example, is open to use. There's a big community, kind of support community around the use of that kind of platform. Similar with kind of Polis is the technology that V Taiwan uses. Again, that's open source. I know there's been some experimentation with that in a wider UK context. So again, there's no reason we couldn't do this in Wales. The technology is there, and the community is there to support with that kind of undertaking. It just needs initiative. It just needs that kind of taking forward. And I think, one of the things that I would like our panel to be looking at is exactly how can we support people to try out these things, to have a go. What do we need to do to enable people to take the resources already out there to try to do kind of participation and deliberation differently?
Interesting. We've got a question from Sarah. Social media is arguably at the forefront of democratic innovation. Did your research look at this at all?
No, we didn't look at social media in and of itself. No, we didn't. I think there's probably more to expand there on social media and democratic innovation. Certainly social media kind of is an open platform for opinion, right? And sharing opinion, we know that. But I think what you don't get in social media that you get with some of these approaches is actually A balance of perspectives, ideally, time to reflect, to listen to other perspectives and engage with them, and to think about other perspectives. And particularly, I think, in a deliberative process, I think you are trying to get a discussion which is actually very difficult to get just through social media. So it's really, how do you facilitate those kind of different voices in a way which allows everybody to be heard and listened to, and to find a way through those different perspectives in a way which is kind and considerate and respectful of different opinions.
Mm. Another question here. How do we communicate the potential benefits of democratic innovations with the Welsh public, particularly those that don't currently engage with democracy or feel they lack a voice? Good question from Hugh Marshall.
Yeah, so I think the way to communicate the benefits to the Welsh public is actually to do more of these things. Because what we know, again, from international evidence is that when people get a chance to participate in these processes, they feel kind of enriched by the process. They learn more about democracy. Not just about the specific issues that they've looked at, but also they are more interested in politics more broadly. And there's some evidence to suggest that actually there are kind of knock-on effects in terms of they become more active in their communities, or they're more likely to kind of turn out to vote. So I think the value of these things is precisely that they give an opportunity directly for people to be involved. And it's through that experience of taking part that potentially, again, if you do it well and meaningfully, then you kind of sell these approaches to the Welsh public. And again, I can speak to our experience through the Constitutional Commission, where we did do some different participation and deliberation across Wales. And again, that was exactly our experience. People who were not interested in politics, didn't feel they knew very much about Welsh democracy, but actually, if you give them a chance to think about these things and explain to them kind of what's at stake, what is this about, why does it matter for you, in our experience, people do want to take part. They really appreciate being asked, and they always have a view in the end, even in our case about quite complex constitutional issues. So I think there was learning there for us as a commission in terms of the value of these kinds of approaches.
Interesting. Okay. Got a question from Paul Silk, who says, is the aim of democratic participation to best represent the views of the largest number of citizens? If so, should we accept that populist policies disliked by traditional elites may be the result?
Well, I think it partly comes back to the distinction between participation and deliberation. I mean, participation, elections aim at kind of participation, the largest number of people to vote, and then we see the outcome. And if the outcome is kind of populist politics, then that's the outcome, because that's the democratic process. I think part of the challenge of participatory democratic innovations is precisely the challenge of self-selection. Some of the people who kind of with the loudest voices will be the ones who will participate, and so you get perhaps particular views coming through those kinds of processes, which is different from a deliberative process. And again, that's why it's important to differentiate, I would say, between participation and deliberation, because deliberation, typically the kind of deliberative process that you get with a democratic innovation is precisely trying to get away from kind of that polarization or that kind of subsection of voices, and looking at a wider range of views, but also then having the time to be informed about these issues, having the time to discuss, reflect on those issues, and come to an informed position. And, a lot of these kind of deliberative processes specifically are often advocated as a way to counteract kind of populism and polarization in politics, precisely because of the process that they employ.
And the report does look at referenda specifically, and therefore looks
Yeah.
at examples of referenda, especially in Northern Ireland, wasn't it, of a citizens' assembly that accompanied a referenda to ensure that the basis of that national conversation on a really heated policy question in access to abortions was,
Yeah, in Ireland.
yeah,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
an interesting example that picks apart some of those questions as well.
yeah, yeah.
We've got another question. Oh no, it's do either of the panelists, okay. Do either of the panelists have any thoughts on the role that communication plays in strengthening democratic participation? And this comment kind of talks about 20-mile-an-hour policy as an example of this. Had there been some form of deliberative method take place, maybe ahead of the implementation of that some of the communication challenges that Welsh Government had with that, would they have been alleviated? Or, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I certainly think that that's the kind of issue where you could certainly have used the participatory or deliberative process to think through that policy, and particular the implementation of it. And yeah, to kind of again bring different perspectives into thinking about how to develop that policy and then implement it. So I think, yeah, that's an excellent example of where thinking differently about policy making can actually perhaps lead to a better policy outcome.
Yeah, and some of these challenges, like 20 miles an hour, will echo some of the more interventionist policies that future Welsh governments are going to have
Yeah.
to go in that direction when it comes to net zero, especially um, yeah, things like home heating are difficult decisions that don't have an easy fix without kind of some behavior change taking place. The only other thing I would think about there is it's a whole other set of issues, but in a Welsh media environment, it's very difficult to
Yeah.
when lots of people get their information from UK-wide media outlets, it's very difficult to kind of cultivate that national conversation. Therefore, some democratic innovations can be something that aims to support that civil society conversation about certain challenges and feel like people have agency in that discussion rather than something being done to them. But good.
Yeah, I would just add on that, there is always, with all of these approaches, the challenge of, whatever recommendations or decisions that body or group of people come to, of explaining those or communicating those more widely. And that is not an easy challenge. And I think particularly in the Welsh context, as you've referred to, kind of the media context makes that difficult. So again, these approaches are not an easy solution. They can solve some things, but they're not the kind of the panacea to all of the challenges that we face.
Yeah. Okay, got a question from Rupert. Is there a part of the report addressing data democracy outside public bodies, as in the use of citizen data platforms getting used already? For example, OpenStreetMap, Wikimedia/Pedia, etc.
No, there's not, but that sounds interesting. I'd like to know more. So, yeah, if that person wants to follow up with me with specific things that they're interested in, I'd be interested to know more about what they have in mind there.
It does sound interesting in regards to there's definitely lots of different forms that not necessarily in Wales, but of planning infrastructure
Mm.
changes, of using participation and deliberation in digital platforms to kind of say, we're going to be doing quite a big change to what your local built environment looks like. How can you look into that? Some of those methods speak to that, but
Mm.
yeah, interesting. Got a question from Becky Harford. I love all these ideas, and it feels to me that all the systems we have set up are hierarchical, and this feels like trying to level the playing field a bit. It's about people feeling like they have a stake in what happens. How can we inspire people to want to take part, and how can we ensure people are compensated for their time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I'll take the last bit first, kind of compensating people for their time. That's a really important question. And good practice is actually that we should be paying people for their time. So citizens' assemblies for example, typically would pay people to take part. And why shouldn't we pay people to take part, in particular when we know that a lot of people don't take part in democracy because there are structural constraints to doing that. And so, for example, if we're asking somebody to come to a citizen assembly for 3 weekends on the trot, so what about their work commitments? What about childcare commitments? What about travel? And if we're really valuing people's time, if that is what we are wanting to tell them, that we really think that your time and your thoughts are important, then why shouldn't we be paying them? So good practice is to pay people for their time. And I think, again, it can help with ensuring kind of broader participation for people who wouldn't otherwise participate in many cases. But having said that, I think part of the challenge of kind of doing more of these things is actually public bodies aren't always willing to pay people for their time. There is a kind of a culture change there that's really a barrier often to doing some of these things. And how do we get people to want to take part? Again, in my experience, if people believe that it's something that is important to them and that they will have a say, then people will want to take part. And I say this as having recently helped out with a citizens forum in Blaenau Gwent on local travel. And the people kind of who put themselves forward to that and who were selected to take part in that were people who were interested in the issue, who wanted to make a difference, and who had been told right from the outset that this will feed into the local council's planning around local transport. So you can get people to take part if you are serious about wanting to hear what they have to say and giving them a meaningful opportunity to kind of then feed into policy making.
Okay. We've got a question here, and I'm trying to rattle through them quickly. Events and circumstances affecting Wales, but caused from outside are not within the Future Generation Commissioner's remit. How can that situation be overcome? Don't know if you've got an answer to that. Maybe not.
No, I'm not sure what they have in mind there. So I think, what we have in our control is what we can do in Wales, and the Future Generations Act gives us a framework. I think there's a lot more that we need to do around the implementation of that act, and particularly I'm interested in this involvement way of working. So I think it's about what is it in Wales that we have control of? What are the resources that we have in Wales that we can bring to bear on these questions? And how can we marshal those resources as well as kind of the interest out there? And there is wide interest in these approaches and how to do more of them. The challenge is kind of how can we marshal all of that together to actually make meaningful change?
Yeah, and we are where we are. Let's work in the process where we're in, the powers that we're in, and that's the same for kind of the multi-layer governance we have. Okay, we've got one last question I'm going to try and rattle through. It's from Jess Blair. Her question is around political buy-in and how we bring decision makers and civil servants along on this journey. She's reached out to some MSs about deliberative processes, and they said they aren't needed because they have elections and that the cost is prohibitive. Is this something that can be dealt with through awareness raising and knowledge building, or do we need to take a different approach?
So I think it's partly awareness raising, knowledge raising. I think there's some interesting research that's been done around particularly how do you get that buy-in. And I think it's about kind of framing these things in terms of actually how they can help you to do things better, thinking about practical challenges that politicians face, and framing these things in that way. But I think it's a challenge. I think there is a lot of talk about these things are important, we should be doing more of them. But actually, when it comes down to it, in my experience, a lot of politicians don't really understand what these approaches mean. And also, again, when it comes down to it, they're not always willing to cede that power, to open up, to allow citizens to have a say. So there's a job of work there for sure to kind of to raise awareness of how these approaches can help. And I think there's a lot to be said about kind of working through kind of pilot projects, getting a few people on board and using them as champions then within the civil service, within government, within parliaments to then actually push forward these agendas. And again, we know from other cases where a lot more is being done in this space that actually is really important. You need to have, first of all, a few people on side who kind of you convince, and then you work with them to champion within their own kind of settings how these approaches can be valuable.
Yeah, and I think part of this is what this paper is trying to do is basically say, rather than having kind of conversation that isn't particularly feel like it's tangible and evidenced by case studies, is going, here are some of the options, here are some of the good things about those options, here's some of the bad things about those options, here's how they can be done well, here's some of the trade-offs, here's where they've been done and what we learned from them. So I see that as this report as part of that.
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
Sorry for all of the people that I didn't get to your questions. We'll try and put some of those to Anwen via email. But you've also got the report that some of which talks to some of the questions directly. So I don't want to overrun, and I want to thank Anwen for your time today, and also you and your colleagues in writing the report. We really hope this kicks off a stimulus for public conversation ahead of your new group, which will kick off at some point this year, I assume. We know there's loads more work to do to strengthen democracy in Wales, and hope this report starts to have an evidence-based discussion on what tools we can use to do some of these bits, tackle some of those challenges effectively. Thank you, everyone who joined us. Please do post about the event or the report after its launch, which it should be live now. And yes, consider becoming a member if you aren't already. Your support enables us to continue having these kind of conversations to bring about tangible change to people's lives in Wales. Thank you very much. Diolch.
Diolch yn fawr.